scattered throughout 4,418 villages. A dozen villages had over 90 fosterings each. One thing that is often overlooked is that there were a series of laws passed in the 1800s, making it almost impossible for unwed mothers to keep their babies. The 1833 Poor Law Reformation introduced bastardy clauses that shifted the entire responsibility for the illegitimate child onto the mother. Social stigma meant that she would not be able to provide care for her child and would be forced to hand them over to the authorities, or worse. Advertisements for adoption or nurse care became popular in newspapers. And, as many scholars have pointed out, these were a front for what was termed baby farmers, or paid murder. As Dorothy L. Haller states, the adverts may have been misleading to the general public, but read like a coded message to unwed mothers. No references are asked for, and none are offered. The sum of 15 shillings a week to keep an infant or a sickly child was inadequate, and a sickly child and an infant under 2 months were the least likely to survive, and the cheapest to bury. Infants were taken, no questions asked, and it was understood that for £12 no questions were expected to be asked. The transaction between the mother and the baby farmer usually took place in a public place, on public transportation, or through a second party. No personal information was exchanged. The money was paid, and the transaction was complete. The mother knew she would never see her infant alive again. Most children, however, were not murdered, but were dropped off at the doorsteps of orphanages or the workhouse. All children taken into these institutions were given entirely new identities. They were provided for with shelter, food, and clothing temporarily, and then sent off to workhouses or another location. Photographs in the 19th century were scarce, but towards the end of the century, we see more photographs, and the last continent to experience such mass exodus of orphans was the United States. And it is here that we see evidence of the orphan trains. The first group of these orphans arrived in Michigan in 1854, and from that moment on, the movement shipped hundreds of thousands of children across the states until it ended in 1929. Officially, there were over 97 institutions involved in orphans and orphan trains in the 19th century. And again, this was not just the United States. Annie McPherson will go down in history as a woman who scammed more than 100,000 foundlings and shipped them from the United Kingdom to Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and even to the outer edges of the earth in Australia, so that they could be sold into child labor. Why do we see so many photographs of orphans in workhouses? Why are they working with machinery created for adult use? Were there not enough adults during this time to carry out this work? And then there is the strange case of the burgeoning American amusement parks at the turn of the 20th century. In addition to rides and exhibits, many of these parks featured an unusual attraction: infantoriums. Visitors of these parks could stroll around with ice cream and swing by these stations, a visit equivalent to that of a fully functional neonatal intensive care unit, complete with incubators filled with sleeping, premature babies. History has been kind to Martin Cooney. Touted as a hero, Cooney was the German mind behind the incubators. His first encounter with premature babies, we are told, was at the 1896 World's Fair. He knew immediately that the exhibition would save babies' lives. The technology to keep premature babies alive was expensive, and he knew the public would pay to see the babies in incubators. He would charge an entrance fee at the amusement park to generate funds to help these babies live. Nurses tended to the babies as an enraptured public looked on. Like any other amusement, the premature baby exhibits included carnival barkers who tried to lure the public to come and see the babies. I don't know about you, but I find something very off about these incubators. Advertisers featuring living babies. A lot of the fairs where Cooney showed his babies also featured eugenics exhibitions. Eugenics is a field of corrupted pseudoscience that endorses selective breeding to improve the genetic quality of the human population. Eugenics was inspired by Darwinism and was a driving ideology that fueled the Nazis. Why are people paying to see living babies as if they had never seen a living infant before? Did people of the time not have their own babies? And where are these infants' parents? How did they have the technology in the 19th century to keep premature babies alive in such a way? Or is something off, once again, with the official narrative? There were 80,000 premature babies who were treated in these amusement park incubators. 80,000. The hundreds of thousands of orphans in the 19th century are just barely believable. Were women really that carefree? Did America even have the population numbers to justify 80,000 premature babies? We are not talking orphans here, but infants born prematurely. The narrative is not convincing or realistically fathomable. Where did these babies come from? More troubling is Cooney's background. As many historians have pointed out, he had no medical degree or training. His story is a very similar one of unconvincing philanthropy that we find surrounding some of our contemporary figures today that also do not have medical degrees. And then there is Marie Dressler, a Canadian silent film and Depression-era movie star. She adopted one of these incubator babies. Celebrities and adoption. The official narrative conveniently leaves this out of her story and tells us that she may have had a daughter who died as a small child. But the photographs suggest otherwise. Did she adopt her incubator baby at one of these fairs? Were the fairs a front for illicit adoption of premature babies? Even if they were premature, did that mean they had no parents? Who owned and was responsible for these parks? And what happened to the babies once they grew and left the incubators? If something feels eerily wrong about the entire narrative surrounding these parks and orphans, it's because we are not being told the truth. Why were there hundreds of thousands of parentless children in the 19th century? Where did they come from? They were relocated all over the world. Europe, America, Russia, Australia, Canada. Why? Especially where most still had a living parent. If pregnancy out of wedlock was such a social stigma that resulted in such trauma, why would so many people put themselves in that position in the first place? Did the government really care about social morality enough to pass laws? And all the effort to build and maintain orphanages and orphan relocation networks, would this not burden governmental finances and administration systems? It certainly would have. But, you see, there was a greater purpose behind the government's worldwide agenda: repopulation. The social narrative of chastity was nothing more than propaganda and justification for stealing children. The reason we see empty cities in the early 19th century is because they were in fact empty, void of population. And the reason they are bustling 30 years later is because orphans were shipped into these cities to repopulate them. You see, in the early 19th century, there was a worldwide reset of sorts through depopulation and then repopulation. The people we see in these photographs did not build this architecture. They inherited it, along with a lot of mud. Not only did they inherit it without a clue as to what it actually was and who it belonged to, but they were unknowingly complicit in repurposing pretty much all of these structures. I know, none of this is making much sense at the minute.